Hey, advanced procrastinators, here we are for another session of study guide review for the AP exam, and we're looking at chapter 15 in the 1920s. So you should have already answered these study guide questions, guys. There's only 10 of them for today. And as we go through this today, guys, can you please follow along with the checking for understanding questions? So let's get right into the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties, guys, after World War I. And this is known as a time also as a return to normalcy. And the president who coined the term. Basically, for a lot of Americans, after 30 years of progressivism, populism, progressivism, and World War I, a lot of Americans were tired of trying to fix society's problems, and was a return for a lot of Americans just going back to having fun and return to conservative small town values. Okay, and the president of the United States who coined the term was Warren G. Harding, who is amongst one of the worst presidents in American history because he did so little. And what you need to understand here about his return to normalcy is this is going to affect the gains made by progressivism. How so? Well, the answer to this is government in the 1920s goes right back to laissez-faire. So all the changes that have been done in the United States from 1890 up until the end of World War I are basically ignored by government. And we go back to the way things were with the Gilded Age. And a lot of these laissez-faire policies are going to help lead to the Great Depression. Another thing America does is we renege on our international responsibilities. When World War I is over, the United States is the strongest military in the world, partially because everyone else is dead, but also because America did gear up for the war, right? And with our newfound strength, what America does is we basically go right back to America and we leave Europe and the rest of the world to run themselves. So we basically start focusing on ourselves. Now, something to understand about Harding's administration, what most stands out about it is the scandals that were involved. It wasn't just laissez-faire, but it was Harding and the president after him, Coolidge, putting business people in government, and a lot of these business people took opportunities to try to make money. In fact, Calvin Coolidge said the business of America is business. So businesses had they had a friend in the White House. And the Teapot Dome scandal is an example of the worst scandal of the Harding presidency, okay? And Albert Fall was the Secretary of the Interior. And basically, he took a large bribe allowing for drilling on Teapot Dome in Elk Hills, California, which was land that was set aside as oil reserves for the Navy in case we ever go to war again, right? He was caught and he went to jail for a year, but it became a national scandal and was just a symbol of the kind of corruption that was happening under Harding's administration. Now, for Americans in the 1920s, Americans are going to have access to a great economy, okay? And they're going to have access to new products that were not invented in the 1920s, but they were affordable and offered to people in the 1920s, right? And one reason why people can now afford things like in the middle there, that is a washing machine or a refrigerator, electric refrigerator, right? Is people can now buy items on credit, or they could also go to department stores and purchase with credit as well there too, right? So you could buy now and pay back later. So Americans could now, for the very first time, afford the things that only the wealthy could before. Number two is advertising, right? You have all these brand new products and you have advertising that basically becomes professional in convincing people that their happiness depends on owning the newest product. In fact, people didn't even know they had problems. Remember, Buddy there now must have a girl and he's brushing his teeth, right? Before the 1920s, people really didn't brush their teeth because they didn't know they had bad breath. So advertising is convincing people, hey, your breath is bad. You need to fix that. Gee, I need to go out and buy something that I never even knew I needed in the first place. And the last one is you have radio. Radio is going to become the most popular form of entertainment in the 1920s because it's in the home. You're also going to have film as well too, but radio is something that Americans have access to at the home, and you have access to instant information and commercials and entertainment at home. Now you're going to have news events that happen nationwide, sporting events happen nationwide, okay, and Americans can share in that information that's happening. Now, there's going to be a problem with this. What is the problem that's going to develop with access to easy money and a culture that's pushing Americans to spend? Normally, we say it's good for Americans to spend because when Americans spend, they are circulating money and that money is getting around to everybody in America. But what's the problem with this access to credit and easy money and a culture that says, I need to buy? And the problem is that Americans are going to go into debt. Yes, you can buy now and pay back later, but Americans are going to buy and buy and buy and owe more and more and more money. And this is fine as long as your pay goes up, but wages for a lot of Americans did not go up in the 1920s. So this forced Americans to have a debt every single month when they had a paycheck. So rather than putting their money into new products every single month, they had to put a big chunk of their money into paying off their debt. And this is going to lead to overproduction by 1927, where for the very first time, you're going to have more goods that are being made and they're left unsold. Now, when this happens, let's say Ford and their Model T sitting on the lot, Ford's going to say, look, we don't need to make as many cars this month. And that's going to cause companies to begin laying off workers. And this is going to be one of the first indicators of the Great Depression that's going to happen in the 1930s, beginning in the late 1920s. Now, Henry Ford, how did he revolutionize the automobile industry and its treatment of the workers? Now, Henry Ford did not invent the car. What he did is he made the car affordable for ordinary Americans with the Model T there in the upper left-hand corner, a car that came in any color you wanted as long as it was black. And the idea being, he tried to simplify the tasks and the options on the car to make it as inexpensive as possible, right? And the way he did this, you can see on the right, is he applied the assembly line of the car. So each worker had only one task. They could stay in place, and all they literally needed to do was bolt a piece in. He could speed up production and lower the price of cars, right? So you have basically the first affordable automobile in the Model T. Now, what he did for his treatment of his workers is he paid them an unheard of sum of $5 a day. They are amongst the highest paid factory workers in America that work for him, right? Now, analyze this. Think about this. At a time when robber barons are paying their workers as little as possible, Henry Ford actually turned around and gave his workers a decent wage. And a lot of his friends called him a class traitor. Like, how dare you pay these people and make them think they can make more money? Why do you think Henry Ford was so benevolent towards his workers? And the idea being was with the Model T, a car that every American afford, he wanted his workers to be able to afford to buy one of his cars. That meant basically his workers were giving the money right back to him, right? So this is a good example of actually how circulation of money works. And it's a good way. When you pay workers a decent wage, they can go out and purchase the things that make them happy, and the money goes back into the company again, which leads to even more cars being sold. And the Model T is the was the number one selling car up until the time it's only been surpassed by the Volkswagen Beetle. Now, film is the other popular form of entertainment that's going to come out in the 1920s. And there's a couple of films you will need to know and their impact that they had on America. Okay. In the upper left hand corner, you have the Great Train Robbery. Now, this was not a film from the 1920s. It's 1913, and it was the first feature length movie. Is basically what? Oh, the first feature length movie. Okay. In fact, it was the first movie that a lot of Americans saw, right? The first blockbuster movie is Birth of a Nation up there in the middle, guys. It came out in 1915, and it is a movie that glorified the KKK. It basically said that the KKK saved the South, right? It is a complete lie. Okay, but it is the first movie that everybody in America saw. It's the first blockbuster movie. And because of it, this helped to popularize the KKK. Consumers at the time were not sophisticated enough to recognize that what they saw on film was fictional and dramatically inspired, right? So what they're seeing is, hey, that really happened. Look, it's on film right now, okay? And the KKK is going to rise in popularity in the 1920s and become a national institution. And part of that reason is Birth of a Nation. So even though Birth of a Nation was not a movie from the 1920s, its influence is seen in the 1920s. Now, these two movies, Steamboat Willie, which is the first talking cartoon with its introduction of Mickey Mouse, and The Jazz Singer in the upper left-hand corner, which is Al Jolson in blackface. He's a white person in blackface, which was another form of entertainment. The minstrel show that was very popular amongst Americans, right? These are the first talking pictures, is what you have in the world, okay? And it changes the face of the movie industry, leading way to the great movies of the 1930s. Okay. Now, what you need to understand here is what's the impact film is going to have on the culture of the United States? Now, this is a pretty deep question. And here's basically what the answer is, right? Basically, America before film was a series of regional cultures. We have so many immigrants in this nation, and we're such a large nation, right? That different areas of the nation have their own cultures. I mean, you can look at the South and obviously see, wow, they actually have a different way of doing things in the South. Same in the Midwest, or even like in Wisconsin with the German influences, right? And what's going to happen is all those individual regional cultures that you have in America that brought a lot of Americans together are going to be replaced by a new national culture where people are going to want to emulate their celebrities. And film is going to be one of those ways that that new national culture will be shown to Americans throughout the United States. Now, you have another experiment happening at this time, the 18th Amendment, right? And this is the only amendment in American history that actually limited a right. This was the designed to prohibit alcohol. Now remember, prohibition, which is prohibiting alcohol, is based on the temperance movement, means to temper or control your behavior. And the temperance movement has been a political force in American history since the Second Great Awakening, right? Because women were victims of domestic abuse, and there's a lot more drinking back then in the 1800s than there is today. Right. So the idea was if we can limit people's drinking, it will help people how they live. And that wasn't favored by fundamentalist women in rural areas. They saw drinking as a sin and being harmful, right? Women were the victims of domestic abuse. Fundamentalist Christians believed that drinking was a sin. And in rural areas, a lot of people drink because what else do you do if you're on a farm after it gets dark? Is a lot of people end up drinking. Now, the people who were against this were immigrants and urbanites, right? Immigrants drinking's always been a part of their life. Like Irish have whiskey, and the Italians have wine, and the wine brings out flavor, right? And it's a very very social thing. The Germans have beer gardens on Sunday, right? And urbanites go to a bar, right? So drinking to them is not a sin. It's just something you do as a part of life. Now, the 18th Amendment was essentially a failure, and I've just given the answer why it was a failure. And here's two reasons why the 18th Amendment did not work. It was replaced by the 21st Amendment, okay, and is the only amendment that was actually repealed. And number one is it's hard to legislate behavior, right, guys? You can see this right now with COVID-19, right, where there's protests out there about people wanting to go to the beach or wanting to get back to work, and the government has told everybody to stay home, and people are like, look, I don't want to stay home anymore. It's nice outside. I want to go outside. I want to trust myself to do what I want to do, and I'll stay away from people, right? So government has always had a difficulty in trying to control behavior. The other reason that was a problem is once you made alcohol legal, you made it even more profitable, very much like drugs today, right? And this allowed organized crime to earn more money and buy more guns, and it became more violent. In the upper right hand corner, you have an image of Al Capone. He became the most famous gangster in the United States because he controlled the illicit trade in Chicago, which Chicago allows him to control all the alcohol basically in the middle part of the United States. Now, the Scopes monkey trial, right? This was a trial over what should be taught in school in science. Should it be evolution or should it be creationism, which is a story from the Bible? Okay. Now, right. So the issue is what should be taught. Now, John Scopes was a teacher who was arrested in Tennessee for teaching evolution, right? And the trial was aside, well, what should be taught or not, right? Now, what you need to understand is in the 1920s, there was a new religious movement called fundamentalist Christianity that is gaining favor with a lot of Americans. And this believes in the word for word interpretation of the Bible. So it's not willing to accept science. But the Bible says, look, the earth was made in 7 days, right? And that's it. That's what the Bible says, rather than looking at science, right? So what's happening in this country, and a reason why fundamentalist Christianity is becoming popular, is there's a lot of change happening. A lot of Americans are against the diversity, and that's the rise of the KKK and in the change. Now, in the court case, what ends up happening is John Scopes, the teacher, is found guilty of breaking the law and teaching evolution, right? Um, but there are a couple more important aspects of this court case, right, guys? And you need to understand what is it that changes are happening in America, right? For the people who supported the Scopes decision, what are people so worried about that's changing in America? Can you think of several changes that are happening? And those would be, well, you have women. Women are asserting themselves in the 1920s. You have flappers, which are young women. You saw in the very first images that I had there, guys, who are wearing more revealing clothing and expressing their individuality more. And it comes along line with the 19th Amendment, which has given women the right to vote. You have the Red Scare, which we're going to talk about in just a second, right? It's immigrants flooding the country. And a lot of Americans are thinking by this time in the 1920s, one third of Americans are foreign born or first generation, right? So we've had the largest immigrant population percentage-wise in American history up until this point. And also, as I mentioned earlier, you have technology, you have radios and movies, and you have a creation of a national culture that's not based on conservative values, right? That's not based only on the Bible, okay? And the Scopes trial, right, which is teaching evolution in school, is just seen as another decay in American society by conservatives who would like a return to normalcy. So let's talk about the Red Scare. What is the Red Scare and Attorney General Mitchell's response to it, right? Well, the Red Scare is the fear that communism is spreading in the world, right? In 1919, guys, Russia becomes essentially the first communist nation in the world, and there is a home base for communism to spread around the world, right? And the fear is that a lot of Americans are coming from Eastern and Western Europe are influenced by communism, and they might be bringing it to America. So Attorney General Mitchell Palmer's response were the Palmerates. He had what was then the department, the DJD, I forgot what it was, which later becomes the FBI, round up suspected communists and immigrants and have them deported, right? Now, can you tell me how this roundup of suspected radicals is un-American or unconstitutional? And the obvious answer is, well, the government's targeting an ethnic group unfairly as being different. Yeah, that's right. They are. Just like the government does that today, targeting maybe if it's Muslims or targeting undocumented immigrants. But really, the problem here is this. This was a violation of civil liberties. There is nothing that is against the law about being communist. The First Amendment says you have freedom of speech, so you have the freedom to your beliefs. Also, you have the freedom of assembly. You can get together in a group if you want to, as long as it's peaceful. This is the reason why the KKK was allowed to be a group, essentially, as long as it was peaceful, right? And it became popular. So somehow the KKK became popular, and that's legal. But communism with immigrants, they were being deported, right? And Americans supported these roundups and the deportation of immigrants because of this rising xenophobia that is a result of the return to normalcy, right? Now, these two victims of this xenophobia are going to be Sacco and Vanzetti, right? And they are basically executed for murder. Now, the evidence against them, they might not have been innocent, but a lot of the evidence against them was circumstantial, and it certainly might have been less than beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? But what happened with this case, right, is this case basically brought all kinds of protests around the world. You can see that image in the middle at Trafalgar Square. That is England protesting America about to execute these two Italian immigrants, right? Whereas in America, a lot of Americans supported their execution. Now, why were Americans willing to support the execution of these two men? And the answer was basically that a lot of Americans felt that if you're an immigrant, darker skin, you don't speak English, you're a member of a radical group, they were anarchists, they're not communists, they're anarchists, you know what? They're going to be guilty of something someday, and they probably deserve to die. Which brings us to the Emergency Quota Act of 1924, right, guys? And this is the second Quota Act, but it changes it from the Immigration Act of 1921. And what the Immigration Act of 24 did, it made it even more limiting quota, meaning how many immigrants were allowed into the nation every single year. And in 1921, the first limit said 3% of the population in 1910. The 1924 one limited to 2% of the population in 1890. It also banned all Japanese immigration. So keep in mind now, in 1924, all Chinese immigration is banned and all Japanese immigration is banned. And those are the only two countries where we excluded anyone from coming to those countries. Of course, with the Emergency Code of Act of 1921, right, there is no limit on immigration coming from Latin America, right? Now, why do they use 1890? Well, as you can see in the chart in the middle there, guys, right? 1890 is the year that the number of new immigrants began to outnumber the old immigrants, right, guys? So you can see on the chart here, guys, in green, you have old immigrants in green, which are the larger group here. And then all of a sudden, 1891, 1910, the blue ones here, the new immigrants start outnumbering, especially in 1901 to 1910, by an enormous amount, the old immigrants, right? So that is the change. By cutting it off right here, the amount of immigrants that are going to be allowed in America is going to be based on this chart right there, okay? The 1881 to 1890. Now, can you identify old and new immigrants? And remember what was the attitude? What is an old and new immigrant? And basically, old immigrants are immigrants coming from Northern and Western Europe, coming from Ireland, England, Germany, and maybe Scandinavia. And they were lighter skinned, they were Protestant, and they're English speaking, and they were seen as being good immigrants. We do not, in America, America doesn't hate immigration. We just hate immigration for the wrong groups of people. And the old immigrants were seen as a good group because they did fit in, they blended in. The new immigrants, and that is the blue chart you can see in 1901 to 1910, right? These are going to be Eastern and Southern Europeans. They are going to be darker skinned. They are going to be Catholic or Jewish, and they have a vastly different religion. So you're going to have Russians over here, which, by the way, has already gone communist, right? You have Poles, which are in the shadow of Russia, and you have Italians coming at this time, right? So what America is trying to do is limit the number of immigrants coming from Europe, but it's the new immigrants coming from Europe. Okay, that is it for today, guys. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you guys have a good day.